So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Moulton. I work in Alumni Affairs and Development as a Senior Development Manager with Athletics and Student Affairs. But my main reason to be here today is I'm one of the 9 members of the Gender Equity Committee here on campus. You might know me best as the person who's been sending you numerous emails about this event, first canceling it for a snow day, then rescheduling it for today. So thank you for coming out. We are recording the event today, and so we will send that out to you afterwards. So you can share it with your colleagues who couldn't be here today. Perhaps they're off somewhere warm on March break, or they're hard at work in their offices. So I am not going to take too much of your time. Mostly my purpose here is to introduce our moderator, Omorua Igwakin. Got it, perfect. So I'm done, that's it. And I'll leave it to Omorua to introduce the rest of our panel. Thanks again, and we'll have a time for questions at the end.
Hello, everyone. So thank you so much for coming today. As Chris mentioned, my name is Omorua Igwakin. So just a little bit about me. I'm in my 2nd year of my master's studying applied social psychology, and I'm also part of the Gender Equity Initiative, working as a website content creator. So I get to interview and amplify voices of student groups and other female faculty on campus. So it's been a really fun experience so far, and I'm excited to be able to moderate this event today. So to just introduce our panelists, I'll start from far right here. So we have Tommy Mayberry, who is an educational developer in the Open Education Department at the University of Guelph, and also a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. Then we also have Melissa Tanti here, who is a Community Engaged Learning Coordinator at CESI, which is the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute here. And then we have Francesca Leary, who's an Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies in the College of Social and Applied Human Sciences at the University of Guelph as well. Okay, so we have a few questions, and then hopefully later on we have some opportunity for the audience to answer some questions as well. Okay, I guess. All right, so the first question that I have for you all is to tell us about your role on campus and your relationships to planning on-campus or off-campus events.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. As an educational developer, we work in a kind of partnership and collaborative position with anyone with instructional capacities on campus. So faculty members, course instructors, TAs, and then sort of more broadly construed anything to do with teaching and learning as a discipline or as a field as well. So in terms of event planning, it can be as small as things like communities of practice or curriculum meeting groups, and it can be as big as things like our national conference that we're having at the end of April, with 400 people coming to fit somewhere for a conference on experiential learning. So lots of different sort of event planning can go into my role as well. I'm also, I forgot to add it to that, I'm also the co-chair of the Q of G network here at Guelph, the Queer University of Guelph Faculty and Staff Network. And so again, event planning in that can be as small as things like our steering committee meetings to large kind of campus-wide events and activities that we're doing.
So, hi everybody. So at the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute, I would say everything we do is a kind of public event because everything we do is community engaged. So we're always thinking about, we're always collaborating and knowledge sharing with communities. So we're always having to ask these questions about who is community in this context and how do we engage in a way that's mutually beneficial and reciprocal. So it's sort of always a kind of public event. So whether it's our research shop manager figuring out who should participate in a focus group, or our special projects coordinator actually doing the planning for a large conference, or Lindsay and I in Community Engaged Teaching and Learning developing a co-learning opportunity, Sam working in the Guelph Lab with the city, or Carolyn doing figuring out impacts in her knowledge mobilization strategies. It's all community engagement, so it's all a kind of public event all the time. Yeah.
Good afternoon. So I've been in this position, Associate Dean, for 2 months. So I'm not really sure about the events that I will organize in my next few years, but I know the type of events I organized when I was chair of the Department of Psychology. And they typically were events that were either geared towards students or to our faculty. So we're very internal. I think that probably the more relevant experience comes from a professional, my research aspect, where I've organized a meeting for the Southern Ontario Neuroscience Association here at the University of Guelph, and there's a number of participating institutions that came. And more recently, and probably the reason why I'm here, I was elected president of one of my professional associations, which is the Canadian Council for Neuropsychopharmacology. And as president, I have the honor, I guess, I'm not really sure, but I have 2 years of tenure, and during those 2 years, I have to oversee the organization of our annual meeting. So the very first annual meeting that I have something to deal with is coming up, and it's in Montreal, and the next one is going to be in Vancouver. So these are national events, and for our group, people in my field, and it's been certainly an interesting type of experience that I will probably share with you.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so Melissa, we'll start with you for the next question. But do you have any memorable experiences that led you to realize the importance of inclusivity and equity in event planning?
Yeah, definitely. So the first one that came to mind comes out of community engaged learning project that I had developed in collaboration with one of our community partners, which is the 10 Carden building, 10C building downtown, which is a really innovative co-working space. And so students were doing research to understand the culture of 10C and how it was impacting its members. And really interestingly, one of the topics that kept coming up as meaningful was the washrooms, which designate they're for use by all genders. And the general sentiment was that this was really creating a tone that was really welcoming and maybe stood out in Guelph, and not a lot of spaces, had this kind of designation in their spaces. It's becoming more and more common, but I think that what for me was the eureka moment, and that I wanted to sort of apply to other contexts, was that there was something about designating the washroom as being for all genders, as opposed to leaving a washroom, without a sign, and sort of letting people understand that it was meant to be used by anyone, or having a washroom designated unisex without any signage. It's the difference between somebody having to read themselves into a space and then being sort of called out explicitly as this space is for you, and that seemed really meaningful. So it's that difference between leaving it to people to figure out whether they see themselves in your event or your space. And so I was thinking about how that could be applied to other contexts. And so, for example, we're going to be advertising for a job at CESI sometime in the next couple of months, a student job. And so thinking about in that context, how can we make the language really explicit in terms of calling out to the kind of people we want to or who might not see themselves reflected in the job posting. So we're sort of playing around with, the language, and sort of rather than the sort of rote note at the bottom that the job is open to everyone, actually saying, English need not be your first language to apply for this job, or saying, we invite international students to apply for this job. So ways that we can actually make sure someone doesn't have to read themselves into the job posting, and is this for me, isn't this for me, do I have the skills, don't I have the skills? So that intentionality with the language, I think, is really significant, and that's that difference, right? So going back to the washroom example, sort of leaving a bathroom without any signage, really kind of what it's saying is this is a sort of cis-normative space that you are permitted to use, whereas having a washroom that says, this is for all genders, means this is not a cis-normative space. So there's ways that you can use language to be really explicit and intentional and inviting and welcoming, and I think we can do that in a lot of different contexts. So that's sort of where we're at, is thinking about the ways to have that kind of more meaningful use of language and more sort of express kind of inclusivity. Yeah. Francesca?
So, memorable experience. I created a few slides to show you why it's memorable to me. So there's no way you can read this. You don't have to. It's for me to read you something, okay? But let me just tell you, when I became, I was a student member of this association. I've been going there and presenting posters for ever since my first year PhD. And as a student of behavioral neuroscience, working with rats, so I was just going there for my meeting, present my poster, in and out. That was my extent. But then I got my PhD, then I started to have different jobs and so on. Then I became a little bit more involved in the awards and this and that. Then I started to get more familiar with the organization until one day the vice president said, Francesco, you probably should be, I will nominate you for presidency. And I go, okay, sure, whatever. Fine, let's do that. And then at some point at one of those meetings, something came up, and Jane Foster, that was the person that nominated me, she mentioned something as being a group of researchers that wasn't very inclusive. And historically, so then I looked into the documentation, and I saw the bylaws and the constitution of this group. And I'm reading, the president, he will do this, the chairman will do that, the treasurer, it's his responsibility to do this, and all the language is all laid down in that kind of structure. And I found it surprising at best that in 16, a constitution of an organization that is Canadian uses that kind of language. So I engaged a process to change that, and we just voted everything else. So everything is now inclusive, and there is no such thing anymore of that kind of language. So that we changed the constitution and the bylaws. But associated with that was how the meetings were run. So I wanted to show you. So this is the number of keynote speakers that we had at the meeting. 2010, I actually went through the programs for this meeting just to get a sense. And so males and females, and that's the only level that I'm focusing at this point, just the gender difference here. Consistently, the keynote speaker, the person that came to address everybody was a male. Notice in 2019, which is the meeting coming in Montreal. That's the difference, that's the intervention. This is the symposium speakers, percent female, 20% at best. Now we are about, and then the next meeting is 60%. And awards, that's a different story. Awards is something that perhaps we'll discuss later, because awards, I don't have data, but females percent has been variable, but in some years there was none. There was 0 females. The awards were all two males. And of course, it's a question of why is that, and this is based on nominations. So it's a different kind of problematic, because the question of the meeting, the way we addressed that, and of course it was a communication with the local organizing committee, it's right here. This was the call for symposium, this is what the language. All right, symposium participants should be from various institutions to emphasize cross-institutional collaboration, and should include women, underrepresented minority, and or early career scientist clinicians. A strong justification is required for a proposal in which all participants are from the same institution, or in which participant diversity is not included. So that was the only statement that we included in the request for symposia. And all the symposia we got, they were all very specific about how their application met the requirements that we had. And then we had of course a review committee that if there was a symposium that did not meet what we asked, we didn't select them. So just by doing that, and it was just a statement really, and it wasn't about changing the organization or anything like that, it was about how we displayed what we required for our meeting. We got what I consider to be a much more representative balance of who the scientists are in our organization.
Wonderful, thank you.
Excuse me. My examples are also language-based, so maybe you folks will have to push us in the question period to think about, language obviously is super important and is the surface level of it, but other ways to promote inclusivity. Because the one I want, and I think it goes along with both what you two are saying as well, is around transparency and clarity of language. Because an example for me that really went into event planning was I was taking part in a sort of scaffolded workshop series where we met once a month for 3 hours, and they provided coffee and water and tea and cookies, and the facilitator said, if anyone wants decaf, we also can put it on. And I felt like I wanted decaf, but I didn't want to make them put the pot of decaf on just for me. But I also was aware that other people in the room might want decaf, and so I felt kind of awkward. And so I went up afterward and I said at the end of the first workshop that I would like decaf, but I didn't want to make you put one on. And I also didn't want you to put one on and waste it and everything. And she sent an email out the next day that said, let us know what you would like to drink for the workshops going forward. And then I noticed that the next one, there was juice as well. So somebody also said, like, I don't drink coffee or tea, I would like juice. I'm making that assumption, but based on the juice showing up. And that was a kind of cool moment where I thought just asking, putting the onus on the organizers to say, we're going to be providing X. What do you need / want so that you can participate was a really cool moment. And, the decaf pot was on and more people were drinking the decaf than I had thought, so it wasn't just me. And that's a really small kind of example around like Tommy wanting decaf coffee. But I think it goes to a kind of larger issue as well around inclusivity and accessibility, because we often ask, what are your dietary restrictions? And for me, it's not that I can't have caffeine, it's just that I prefer not to. So it's not a restriction, it's a preference. Somebody also, maybe they couldn't have coffee at all and they wanted the juice, or they just thought, I'm healthy this month and I'm going to have orange juice kind of thing. So the other example is also about language, but it's with accessibility. And seeing a conference asking us, please let us know what you need to access the space successfully versus what are your accessibility needs, I thought was really helpful, because I don't identify as needing an accessible space, but I really prefer hard copies and paper copies of slides with me just for the way that I engage and follow along with material. So I felt I was able to put that in that question to say, I'd like physical copies of the slides, whereas if the question had been, what are your accessibility requirements, I would have assumed that question wasn't for me. So again, the language shifts in that I think are really important, but again, putting the onus on the organizers to make sure everyone's set up for success and is able to access and be included in the space really changes the dynamic in what people are getting when they come to your events.
Excellent. Okay. All right, Tommy, I'm going to throw it right back to you for the third question. So what is your key advice for thinking about equity in event planning for folks who are planning events on campus?
Thank you. My key advice would be to think about how people are being included and to push it further and ask yourself, and who's not being included? So to actually not just think through, we need to make sure that if people want juice, we have juice, but thinking through who else might be excluded or not able to access, the space or the halls or those sort of things as well. And to really, the side of that then thinking about who's not included, to reframe questions so that the onus is put on the organizers. So the organizers are saying, how can we make this event inclusive, accessible, safe, productive, successful for you as the participant? When we're doing event planning, we're doing it not for ourselves, right? It's not a kind of pat on the back that was, the room looked fantastic, although maybe that is a key piece of it, but it's to get folks coming out and participating in that programming or in that event. So it is about them. It's about them and how they're going to successfully engage. So I'd say think about who's not included and deliberately ask yourself, who might we be excluding by this language or this room or those sort of things, and then put the onus on yourself to make sure that you're opening that dialogue for them rather than getting them to declare and identify things on their own that they maybe won't if you don't open the door properly.
So when this event was first planned, it was inclusivity in events and institutions. And I think that's a really important part of thinking about inclusive events, is that events inclusivity in events isn't an add-on, as in, you know, I'm having this event, now I need to make sure it's inclusive. If you have an inclusive institution or a robust approach to inclusivity in your institution, an offshoot of that is going to be inclusive events. So if you have a diverse team organizing your event, you know, various kinds of capacities and interests and languages and all these sorts of things that go into, you know, approaching a question or a topic from multiple perspectives and according to multiple needs, then an offshoot of that is going to be inclusive events. So I would say, you know, the focus is on first making sure you have a really robust approach to inclusivity within your organization or your event planning committee or your department or your college. And if you have all those voices and needs and capacities and interests at the table, there likely won't be oversights after the fact. Oh shoot, we didn't think of this. And then another a more practical way of, you know, trying to make sure you have kind of representation is to think about your audience and the community you're trying to engage, and engage those individuals in the planning of the event. So your proposed audience, the community that you're trying to engage, this is just a principle of community engaged scholarship, should be part of the planning committee and should be considered to be collaborators in the event. That would be probably the most effective way. Yeah.
Well, I have little to add to this. It makes sense. It's comprehensive and it's very clear. So.
So then, Francesco, most people are familiar with the idea of equity of access, such that we'd never have an event on campus that wasn't wheelchair accessible. But are there other barriers to access that are less visible that we should be thinking about?
I will suppose so, yes. And that's probably where these advices are coming from. Anybody that is organizing an event should do their best to think about how to make it inclusive, and also think about who may be excluded specifically. Sometimes people think in some ways, right? So they don't have the ability of coming out and thinking in different ways. That's probably why having partners that are there, that are motivated, they know the environment, that they know the group, is probably the type of ally that you want, that will give you the knowledge that you want to have, but it's not in your domain and that you need to learn. So it's probably, what you guys suggested is a very good way of going about it. Yeah.
Tommy, anything to add?
I like how the question said, you know, inclusivity that might be less visible, but I wanted to think about inclusivity that's invisible, that we actually can't see. Because there are certain things when you would, and when I mean can't see, it's also in people, but it's also in advertising. So something like putting up a name and a bio of who the panelists might be gives you some information, but it doesn't give you all the information. Putting up photos starts to give more visual information. Starting to put up things like pronouns, starting to put up things like other minority groups that people may feel they identify as and want to disclose. Disclosing majority groups can also be something where it can be invisible sometimes to see able-bodiedness or to see whiteness. So to clock those things and to call them out and say, you know, I identify as part of a Caucasian community, I'm an able-bodied, I'm not cis, but I'm an able-bodied X kind of majority person, can be a lot of ways to bring those invisible or not seen types of inclusivity into the conversation, so that people know that, you know, they're okay, you know, I can't base a lot off of these names, right? You know, we can read things into names that look or sound certain ways, but we're making assumptions. So to try to remove that assumption from folks when they're looking at the planning stage of that and the transparency can really help with the invisible barriers, excuse me. And then the other thing would be kind of along those lines of what do you need to be successful, to ask what else, right? You know, going through your checklist of saying, okay, accessibility requirements, bathroom requirements, food requirements, what else? You know, maybe you've gone through your checklist of what you think and your committee thinks folks need to be successful, but maybe a participant has registered who has something that they need or want to be successful that wasn't covered in that kind of script. So just a box that says, what else do you need to be successful in our event? And you might be surprised at the things that come up that you can implement to, excuse me, make sure everybody is getting the most out of that event.
I'll just add, like, just really briefly, I love that idea of asking what people need in order to be able to participate fully. And then, you know, prior to that, I think before you ask any kind of logistical questions, there's a lot of self-reflection that has to go into acknowledging what you're not seeing as your own privilege potentially, or what is normalized for you in planning an event. So I think there's a lot of questions around, you know, what are you presuming are people's financial means in order to be able to get this event? And there shouldn't be any kind of cost associated, or maybe there's a sliding scale. What are you presuming about the way people use their time, or the kind of time they have available? What are you presuming about the way people process information? What are you just really questioning, like, who do you have to be in order to be able to attend this event? And you know, what skills or capacities do you have to have in order to receive the information in the ways it's being given? You know, what are you assuming people are, even in the way that questions are being asked? Have you even assumed this question is of interest to everybody? Or is that the way that it should best be asked? So a lot of sort of self-reflection goes into just the framing of the event and the topic before you even get to the logistical planning. And I'm going to call out an event that happened on campus recently as sort of an example of when this doesn't go well. So there was a Women's Wellness at Work event last year that was scheduled for 7:30 in the morning. So I'm a sole support parent. I do not have a co-parent. I probably would benefit from a wellness at work event, socialize or share tips and ideas. I was absolutely unable to attend this event. I think a lot of working parents would be unable to attend an event at 7:30 in the morning. So there was a lot that was assumed about the kind of time invitees had available to them, or so that's the sort of know your audience question, right? Really think about who your audience is, what the intersectionalities are there, what the potential barriers are there. So and then, you know, and engage, and perhaps, you know, if there'd been a wider kind of engagement, community engagement, and that can mean campus community as well as broader community engagement around the event, maybe it would have been planned differently.
Okay, so the final question that we have before we turn to the audience here is, what recommendations do you have for folks in dealing with less than positive criticism of equity-related issues around events they've planned? Tommy, we'll start with you.
All right. This one may seem ironic, and I'm not meaning it as a joke. I'm meaning it very seriously. Thank them for bringing that less than positive critical attention to it, because it might have been an oversight. It might have been something that maybe isn't part of your control, but it's good to know and you know, as Melissa's saying, have that dialogue and that conversation as well around that. So definitely thank for that criticism. If it's less than positive is the polite way to put it. If it's rude, or if it's attacking, or if it's challenging in terms of, like, you know, I'll use us as an example, right? Oh, great, you're doing a panel on equity in planning in event planning, and your panel's not very equitable, right? Like, if it's going to be something like that where they're kind of like, you know, pulling one up on you for it, I would kind of gauge the situation to see if they're even interested in a productive conversation. Sometimes they won't be. If they are, you can have that. And if they're not, fall back on, if you're using some of the tips and strategies that we've been talking about, fall back on the level of inclusive promotion you've put into it. You probably won't be, and I always hesitate to say never, because I do believe there could be 100% inclusive, accessible, equitable event. Like, I believe we can get there, but it will take work, and it will take time, and it will take mistakes and stumbles. So own up to the successes that you built into it, and then flag things to continue growing with.
Francesco?
Yeah, so along the same lines, if there is a strategic decision to make events equitable and inclusive, so it's a decision, is an explicit objective of doing so, maybe to get to the 100%, then it's acceptable that it will be a work in progress. And as long as there is a record of how the work goes, every year, every event where comments and mistakes are recorded, and as you go through, they're modified, they're removed, then eventually you probably can get to 100%. But the data have to be kept and looked at and used.
I'll just add in like another sort of way to approach the question too. I think obviously criticism, always listen to it. I think one of the things that I've seen at some events is where in the attempt to be inclusive, it can actually end up a bit confusing as people try to load in sort of every kind of accommodation possible, and that's not ideal because that can actually just be frustrating for everybody. So I think knowing your audience is really, really important, understanding what are the likely accommodations that you should be making. There are ways to be really strategic about that. There are accommodations that have a lot of utility in them. And so, Kendra Schnarr, who's our special projects coordinator at a recent event, she used live captioning. So live captioning has a lot of utility in it, right? Because it's great for people that may be hard of hearing. It's also great for people that may have difficulty following a fast-moving dialogue, either because of cognitive processing issues or linguistic barriers. It makes a transcript available after the fact. It was really helpful, I think, for everybody in attendance. So there's ways that you can, be sort of economically efficient and choose strategies that have a lot of utility to them. But it shouldn't be a matter of trying to just load an event with every possible accommodation. It's really thinking about, again, engaging your community. And this is what Carolyn always teaches me about knowledge mobilization. It's really about engaging your community and really thinking about what the appropriate accommodations would be, and then being efficient, I think, around that as well. And there's little things you can do to signal a safe space for everyone in terms of having, the option on name tags to put one's pronouns if you should choose. There are little ways to signal a kind of safer space for everybody. Yeah.
All right, so that concludes my questions so far. So I would just love to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. So don't be shy. Perfect. We do have microphones here, so if you wanted to come up and ask that way.
Thank you very much for doing this, first of all. I have a question. So as a student who sometimes is involved in event planning and things like that, in a situation where maybe I don't get to choose the committee that I'm working with and things like that, if you find yourself on a committee where there isn't a lot of diversity of any kind, where you look around and you go, well, everyone in this room is white, pretty sure everyone in this room is able-bodied, pretty sure everyone in this room is cis, and obviously there's invisible forms of diversity that might be there, but then you're worried, okay, there's not a lot of diverse opinions in this room. How can you sort of, in that scenario, try and make things as inclusive as possible when you're worried about the lack of opinions?
Melissa, would you like to field that question?
It's difficult because of the power dynamics potentially of being a student in a scenario where you might be with faculty or something like that. I would advise asking these questions, so as opposed to, telling somebody what's missing, asking are we sure this is the way we should be framing the question, or who else can we engage, really getting people to think collectively about who the intended audience is and making sure that those individuals are included in the conversation. So it could mean some outreach or some kind of activism around getting the right people at the table. But in the spirit of collaboration and generating new ideas, do you know what I mean? As opposed to trying to solve the problem, I would suggest getting everyone to think collectively about the questions you should be asking before you start planning this event. Might open up some of those discrepancies that you can then solve together, whether that means you need to go outside your group and engage other people, or some other measures. Might be how I would suggest approaching things.
Yeah, the student piece to your question is a really important kind of trick and nuance in that, because if if it weren't a student who were there, other strategies would be a little bit more ready to come to mind. But I would say to find and feel the empowerment in your voice as a student. You know, universities don't work without you as students. You know, you're kind of one of the most important, if not the most important demographics on the campus. So find that empowerment and feel it. And then, you know, find ways to employ other strategies where you're maybe doing something like, you know, encouraging the group to do an exercise or activity where they, you know, share and disclose majority and minority status, so that the room together starts to notice how white and able-bodied and cis-normative and hetero everybody is in this room, and then maybe the onus moves off of you and they kind of go, hey, you know, maybe we need to change something. But your voice is very important as a student, so don't feel that because you're a student, you can't participate in those conversations.
And actually, that's kind of a decolonizing strategy as well, to acknowledge the relationships in the room first. And so those kind of decolonizing strategies kind of open up other kinds of conversations as well. So I love that idea of starting meetings by acknowledging who's in the room and what the relationships are there. That's,
Sorry, and it's partly selfish on my part because as somebody who, so my pronouns are he, she, and they. So whenever I share my pronouns, that immediately signals to people that I'm, you know, probably non-binary or trans. So, you know, that discloses a lot about my identity. But I feel very uncomfortable as a person who uses pronouns, not just in the fear of being mispronounced, but also in not knowing what other folks' pronouns are so I can respectfully refer to them. So it's partly selfish where I need to know how I can talk about the other people in a room. So it comes across sometimes as me, you know, pushing that forward, but it's also actually more for all of our benefit in the room so that we're all able to move forward. And so you're right, as the kind of decolonizing strategy, you learn things about folks that they maybe wouldn't normally disclose unless you ask them. And a lot of times they are marks of majority that tend to be those invisible ones that when people say them out loud for the first time, it can be kind of wonky. You know, to have somebody who, you know, looks like they would be like a cis heterosexual person share pronouns, they're kind of like, well, you'd assume those, right? And it's kind of like, well, there's a danger in assuming pronouns. So let's unpack this a bit.
Wonderful. Awesome. Yeah, come on up.
Hi. Thank you. This was great. I have a question about basically what you just said, and you referred to that a little bit earlier during the panel as well, about sort of making explicit our identities or our relationships. And I love this idea. And at the same time, it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable because we also want to create spaces where people are allowed not to disclose their identities if they're not ready or interested in doing so. So how do you navigate that? And I'm thinking, not necessarily in particular, but maybe as an example, about a class that we're teaching a course this semester, and as one of the requests that we made to the students in the first class was to write down their names on little post-it thingies and their pronouns, and one of the students just never wrote their pronouns. And, well, in one way, we're like, oh, well, that's a bit strange, and it makes us feel a bit uncomfortable because then we're not really sure what to call them and which pronouns to use. And at the same time, we started worrying that maybe this activity in itself made that person feel uncomfortable because maybe that's something they're not willing to share. So I'm just sort of evolving in that thought process and trying to figure out how to navigate that. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Okay, sorry, just it felt like it came out for it, so I'll start, but please, both of you as well chime in after. This is the educational developer in me because everything comes back to education and comes back to teaching and getting people the information, the tools they need. But it's such an important thing around that is a lot of people don't know what a pronoun is even a part of speech is. There's stigma attached to things like disclosing mental wellness identity, or maybe it is an invisible physical different ability that they have, and they're worried about sharing it because it's stigmatized. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that. So again, it's not just being transparent around, we need to refer to people respectfully. It's being intentional in how you do it as well. So saying, I invite you or I encourage you to share your pronouns, but leaving that door sort of partway open to say if you're comfortable, if you want to, but being able to teach them what that means, right? And so sometimes doing it even with meetings of like faculty members or upper admin as well, not everybody's comfortable or has done a kind of pronoun go around before. I recently, I forget when it was a couple weeks ago, I had done a talk actually on gender pronouns in teaching. That's not where I'm going with that, but we had done a territorial acknowledgement and a couple folks in the room weren't from the campus community, and they came up afterward and they asked what that thing was that we did at the beginning, because coming from Guelph as a community where you don't normally start off staff meetings or you don't normally have an email signature as a territorial acknowledgement, they'd never heard that before. They were interested, but we had actually made the assumption that people knew what a territorial acknowledgement was, and it would have been so much more inclusive for us to have taken that advantage to say, the reason we're acknowledging the territory in which Guelph sits is, and then that way everybody would have at least remembered or had another kind of teachable moment in that. But you're absolutely right, you should never force folks to do that for any number of reasons, but getting them to understand why the invitation is there can at least get them out of not sharing something because they don't know what to be sharing.
Yeah, no, I was just, I mean, you summarized everything I would have said as well. I would just add that I think just asking the question opens the space that things aren't always as they might appear, or like that you can't make those sorts of presumptions, but I think that you would never want to call somebody out and say, hey, you didn't disclose, because you're creating the space to disclose or not disclose, and just by asking the question, you've opened the space of possibility that there may be unrecognized gender identities in the room, and that just sort of creates a little more space for equity, you know, just asking the question, but yeah, never forcing the answer.
Hi, I'm Craig. I work in IT here on campus, and Melissa, you shared the example about live captioning. I was wondering if there are other examples of how technology has a role to play, either in helping with inclusivity or maybe even hindering.
I'm not an expert. You probably have more familiarity with the cutting edge stuff.
Technology is not my forte, but and I mean, I always just as somebody who, you know, I can't even read things on a screen, so I'm, you know, I know it's terrible for the environment, I apologize, but, you know, I like to print out articles and things like that as well. So my example of, like at a conference, I would ask if there could be physical copies of things for that as well. Our rooms on campus are starting to come with more screens and stuff as well, so we have two. You know, if the room was a bit deeper, or even at this depth, having screens there would be helpful for folks at the back of the room, or just sort of, you know, having more things available for that. But with the screen captioning thing as probably one of the most important examples is that actually helps and supports way more people than who it accommodates. My partner refuses to watch movies on Netflix with subtitles. I prefer it. And it's not that I identify as having any kind of deaf gain or any kind of different hearing ability. I just prefer to be able to see the words. You know, that might be my literary studies background that I like reading, but on my own, I will always put captions on because it creates a different space for me to engage. So, you know, even things like if you're showing a YouTube video and something, to put the closed captioning on for that, not just for the folks who would have disclosed that I need that, but for everybody in the room to be able to access it the same way, in a better way.
I was wondering, you said hinder? Hinder, how would you see it? I'm interested in that. What would be an example of technology hindering?
You tell me.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would just want to have a discussion here. I'm not throwing back at you. I'm just wondering if somebody's looking at a screen and they're not engaging socially with somebody else, would that be the level? Could be having the text that bothers you because it appears there and somebody's reading it but you're bothered by it, and, you know, or...
I didn't really have anything in mind. I just
right.
wondered if there were experiences.
Yeah.
I might have an example. Or go ahead.
Several other hands went up for examples.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that made me think of if someone indeed cannot see a screen or might have trouble engaging with moving images,
right,
or might be deaf, then screening a video or something might be a problem for some members of the audience.
Yes, right. But I guess I was wondering if you try to accommodate their perceptual issues, is your accommodation disturbing the perceptions of somebody else? That's what I'm wondering about, and it's an interesting question. I'm trying to work it out.
In the research on this, actually, with technology in the classroom, it's completely polar, because you bring technology to the classroom, can have a very tech-forward classroom. There's a ton of research to support it as well, but there's just as much research with data to back up that it distracts students who aren't using technology, that it can be more distracting, like a student on a laptop watching Netflix in class. They're making a choice to focus on Netflix and the lesson. The person sitting 2 rows behind is not making that choice. They're distracted by the technology, and their learning is at a deficit from that. And then when technology doesn't work, right? It's great to have the captioning, the live captioning. When that doesn't work, or it's an older model where it's actually not getting the words right on the screen, it can create more barriers than it removes.
One thing, if I may, that I was thinking about when you asked your question, Craig, is that I don't really know that much about technology, but I would be super interested in exploring ways by which technology can help people not only follow and learn from the panel or whatever is happening at the event, but also engage with the presenters and with the event. I was thinking about possibility to ask questions on Twitter, or to participate in ways that do not involve standing up and coming to the microphone. Might be an interesting way of using technology.
Yeah, because we do know that from classroom situations that those technologies enable students that don't necessarily feel comfortable, being singled out to actually add their ideas. So the same way it works in a classroom, So the same way that what you're talking about works in a classroom, we can imagine a conference scenario also wanting to include the voices of people that don't want to be singled out at a microphone like that. Yeah, that's a great point.
This makes me, though, think about how polarizing it is, because when you do that way, that is impersonal, then you can also unleash all kind of hatred that you essentially are hiding behind a screen. So I can see how the same thing can have opposing effects when you deal with this computers or whatever projectors, right? It's interesting. Thank you.
This is a great discussion. We don't have that much time left, and I think my question's kind of big. I'm involved in planning the Families in Canada conference that's coming up on campus end of March, and we have a very small budget to work with. Part of what I haven't heard come up is how to make people feel included in the conference. That might include speakers. Compensation is really important. You don't want to exploit students or people you're inviting from the community. Part of our issue is that our budget is very limited, and we're trying to decide who we can compensate. Some people wear different hats. Some people are adjunct professors at other universities, but also are community members. So how do you navigate these tensions? You don't want to ask people if they're salaried at their job. That's not really an ethical question to ask.
It's such a great question, and we're always grappling with it ourselves because we work with a lot of community expertise and community experts, and I think it's something that needs to be considered more, and I don't think there's an easy answer now, but I think we can think about other ways people can be remunerated other than financial. I mean, that's our go-to, and we'd love to be able to pay everybody, the sort of standard speakers fees, but are there other ways that we can think about what might be a benefit to someone in the interest of mutual benefit? So is it some sort of, promotion? Is it some sort of access to skills development? Is it, some kind of collaborative opportunity? There's all kinds of ways to remunerate people, that are lower cost, gift cards and speakers fees and these sorts of things, and honorariums. But thinking more broadly about how you can recognize people's work and provide mutual benefit and provide remuneration is, I think, what we want to be thinking about in terms of what are the goals, what are they trying to achieve, what are their needs, and is it access to resources? Is it, a membership to our library, to expensive journals that people don't have access to if they're community members, or just really, I think it's a question of the many ways we can remunerate people. And it's an ongoing conversation that we're having as well. Yeah, all the time.
And thinking of other ways to include them as well. So, you know, we often think of the what if scenarios, like what if inclement weather and flights are down. You know, we had 3 snow days, right? You know, this panel was not supposed to happen today, kind of thing, right? So thinking about other ways that you can get ahead of those. So, you know, maybe people can Skype in. Maybe they can send a video in first and Skype in for the Q&A. Maybe there are other ways that they can be included in it that doesn't involve, you know, an international trip and hotels and all that stuff as well. Again, the constraints of technology sometimes can work against that, but finding creative solutions around it too, where the participation doesn't have to be live and can be just as impactful or even more impactful, you know, because if they did their presentation and taped it and sent it in, that can be archived and looked at later and later and later and used in many different ways than a live one that wasn't captured couldn't be. And the Q&A could be more robust because it was like homework beforehand kind of thing.
May I add something? Many of the meetings that I go to and that I talk to and so on, and nobody gets paid. And you know, we all volunteering our expertise or our time, and the question is, why do we do it? Well, also almost because we want to do it. It's our outlet to disclose what we do. So then the question is, what can you do to find those people? It's about selecting the right people that really want to be part of the event because they have something to convey and they want an outlet. So will you call in?
My pushback would be that some people can't be at the event without the compensation, which would be working towards the inclusivity.
Right.
But your point is well taken.
It's a combination.
Especially we're talking about adjunct professors and, you know, people that are precariously employed and contract laborers. Yeah, it's something that we have to think about. Oh, I don't know if you heard that.
Sorry, I had one quick question. I know you guys are wrapping up soon. I just had a question. So, like, I'm a student on campus as well, and a lot of the events that I'm involved in planning have to occur on campus. And one thing that I found is our physical space is restrictive in a lot of ways. So I just hosted a conference this past weekend, for example, in the McKinnon building. And with the extension being locked on weekends, there are no gender-neutral or accessible bathrooms in that building. So I was just wondering, with your experience on campus, if there were any ways that you've kind of navigated around the physical space restrictions.
That's so tricky because often those are quite literally immovable as barriers for that. But in terms of the access to all gender washrooms or inclusive washrooms, I know because not everyone on campus will be inclusive, accessible, and all gender. You know, sometimes you're getting a couple of the slices of that, you know, total bathroom. But you can work with, is it police services? Is that the yeah, you can work with those folks as well to make sure that there is a door that could be open or a fob given for a temporary amount of time or something as well for those physical spaces. And then there's also ways that you can request rooms that are accessible, and you know, sometimes that involves a lot of different pre-planning and things like that as well. But it often can be getting into a different space if possible.
Yeah, I mean, the ideal would be the investment in the infrastructure, but if the places will let you move them around or cover them up or change signage, you know, you can be creative, and you should try to be, if possible. Yeah.
So. Yeah, I've been at more than one conference now where the conference organizers just took over the washrooms and made them all gender neutral for that day.
Yeah.
So it's something super easy, right? Just slap something over the sign.
Yeah. I will say, as a really particular detail though, maybe cover the urinals, just so that they don't end up being made available, and it really is then gender inclusive, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for your time today, and to our panelists. Maybe we can give them a round of applause. Our form of remuneration is honey. It's sweet, and it's grown on campus. So it's got a very small environmental footprint. So thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me and I can triage them to the group. We will be sending the recording out when it is finished, so please feel free to share it with your colleagues. To the question that was asked by about building an inclusive committee, we are always looking for recommendations and ideas on speaker panels as we start to. This was our first one, so thank you for being our guinea pigs, for lack of a better term, or helping us get started. But we're absolutely looking for recommendations, and we're looking for people who want to help us continue to help move gender equity forward on this campus. So thank you for your time. There's plenty of food, there's coffee, there's tea. If you have to run off to your meeting, we said 1 o'clock and we're 1:03, so I feel like I failed one of my main goals for the day. But please take some with you, and thanks again for coming out and supporting gender equity at the University of Guelph.